Is SIBO really the problem, or is your gut missing the shield that keeps bacteria from sticking? Killing and clearing bacteria do help, but if your gut shield is thin, bacteria stick and regrow. Well, meet Secretory IgA, your small intestine's non-inflammatory shield. Strengthen it, and your risk of relapse goes down. Your small intestine, it's not meant to host a crowd, and it stays that way through stomach acid, bile flow, optimal motility, digestive enzymes, and an intact ileocecal valve, and a quiet bodyguard called Secretory IgA. Well, today I'm going to show you how and what Secretory IgA is, 5 simple ways it can stop SIBO, why it often ends up being low, how to support it, and all of that so that you're not fighting the same battle every few months. But before we get into it, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and for over 20 years, I've been helping first-time and recurrent SIBO sufferers restore their gut function by targeting all 3 phases of the condition to resolve symptoms in a timely manner. What is Secretory IgA? Secretory IgA is a special antibody your gut makes locally. Now, let's also define antibody here because that's really going to tell you what Secretory IgA does. Antibodies are nothing more than proteins from your immune system. They recognize and tag specific germs. So when your immune system locally in your gut, since that's what we're talking about, sees a foreign particle, it's going to use an antibody to tag that foreign particle. And specifically, the antibody we're looking at here that is most relevant in this environment is going to be Secretory IgA. It's released into the mucus layer, so literally it's made on the back side of your gut lining, and then it moves through your gut cells and then out into the mucus layer. And it's going to be able to work in very harsh environments like your small intestine. Keep in mind, the small intestine should have adequate amounts of bile and enzymes that are intended to kill off the bacterial overgrowth in that area or to just reduce the bacterial population. So we would consider that a harsh environment. But this Secretory IgA can still work in that harsh environment a lot in part because of its secretory component, if you will. The intention behind Secretory IgA, and this is the key point that you want to latch on to, is that it's going to neutralize these microbes without leading to big inflammatory fireworks as a byproduct of that. We don't want your immune system to get ramped up, and these antibodies putting these tags on these specific foreign particles, germs, bacteria, byproducts of these bacteria, when it does that, it allows the immune system to neutralize that without that foreign particle becoming part of a cascade that leads to an inflammatory process. If that does happen, this is where it can start to break down the gut lining and start to cause separation in the cells in the lining of the gut, and many would term that as leaky gut. Let's look at where Secretory IgA fits in as far as being a host defense. In some of the other videos of recent in this series, we've looked at things like acid. Acid lowers the total amount of incoming bacteria in the stomach. Once we transition from the stomach and move then into the small intestine, we see the activity of bile coming into play where it's going to break down the membranes on these bacteria, but it's also going to signal motility to continue to occur. We get enzymes that are not just helping us digest food, but they're also digesting and breaking down some of these microbes. And then from a just structural part of the body, maybe to say it as an anatomical consideration, you have the valve, the ileocecal valve, between the large and small intestine, and that prevents the contents of the large intestine from flushing back into the small intestine and repopulating with that bacteria. So your ileocecal valve comes into play there too. But there's also Secretory IgA, and Secretory IgA is going to be that surface shield in your small intestine that's going to stop those microbes from sticking to that environment, from sticking to those cells in the first place and allowing them to cause an insult and to cause damage. The beauty of secretory IgA as it relates to SIBO is that there's not simply one mechanism by which secretory IgA is working. It's a relatively complex immune system protein, but to keep this conversation straightforward, let me just share a couple of ways with you that it works, just so you have an appreciation for how important having secretory IgA levels around are. So one thing that it's going to do is it's going to block the adhesion. So meaning that when these microbes are trying to attach to a surface, the secretory IgA is going to coat those microbes so that they can't latch onto the intestinal wall. If they can't stick to the intestinal wall, then that also means that they're not going to be able to colonize the intestines either. So inherently right there, you're slowing down their growth patterns. The next thing is that it can also accentuate the clumping. So meaning that it causes the bacteria to adhere to each other because it's literally creating cross links into the bacteria or between the bacteria. So this causes clumps or just bunches, if you will, of the bacteria. Now, the reason that's important is because they become less functional when that happens to them. But more importantly is that it also makes it easier for the normal muscle movement through the small intestine, what's often termed peristalsis, specifically the migratory motor complex. When you talk about it in regards to SIBO, it causes that to allow this sweeping motion to push that bacteria on into the large intestine so it can ultimately be eliminated. There's also what's called mucus trapping. So this is somewhat a similar concept, but not exactly the same. But here, that secretory IgA is going to anchor to the mucus layer. So remember, your gut lining has a mucus layer. It's actually two sections thick. You have an outer and an inner mucus layer. But that mucus layer is where these coated microbes are going to get caught up in that layer. And just as before, when those normal motions of motility come along, well, you're getting them out. Remember though, these bacteria, they're also creating byproducts. So just through their normal metabolic activity, they create byproducts. And these byproducts can stimulate the immune system. They can stimulate these inflammatory cascades as well. And secretory IgA has the capacity to do that. So it prevents these toxins from these microbes from irritating the tissues locally in the gut. And the beauty of that is that you keep control of that collateral damage, those inflammatory processes and the secondary destruction of the tissues that come along with that. All of that is kept at bay. And then you just get this inherent built-in staying power, if you will, with secretory IgA, where secretory IgA, it's going to be able to carry a component, carries a secretory component. And remember, that's the name, secretory IgA. That secretory component resists digestive enzymes. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier. That secretory component, because it's more resistant to those digestive enzymes, you allow this protein, because this immunoglobulin is a protein, and when you think about enzymes can digest proteins, but the reason that this protein is not digested is in part because of that secretory aspect to it. And right where SIBO is occurring at, you have this beneficial immune system protein, the secretory IgA. It shows its resistance and helps out with dealing with the SIBO and not being broken down by the enzymes. It's like getting the best of both sides of the molecule. What are some of the things that are going to cause secretory IgA to be low? Now, as I go through this list, I also want you to think about which ones of these resonate with you and how could this be impacting your immune system. So the first is going to be chronic stress. Now, don't blow chronic stress off. And I also want to define chronic stress in a couple of different ways, because most of you inherently hear that and you think emotional stress. That's not the only way you should be thinking about this. In fact, I would actually put that behind the ones I'm getting ready to list for you. But lack of adequate sleep, it's not sleeping at the right time in the right time frames, that's all going to be impactful. That's a major stressor. Blood sugar fluctuations. Chronic inflammation. These are very important stressors on the body that if they're not dealt with, they're ultimately going to have a negative impact on the immune system, and that means that this secretory IgA level, it's going to decline. But that's not the only thing. You can also have nutrient gaps that are going to come into here. One of the ones that should immediately jump to the top of the list here is vitamin A. Vitamin A is influential in almost every step as it relates to secretory IgA, from the production of secretory IgA to the development of the cell types that produce and influence the movement of secretory IgA, even to the release of secretory IgA into your gut. Vitamin A influences that. But the key here is that vitamin A doesn't act by itself. It also has a partner in this, which is zinc. So you really need to know what your vitamin A and zinc levels are if you want to optimize your secretory IgA. There's some people that just have inherent immune deficits, so you can have what's called selective IgA deficiency, and then just broader overall immune deficiencies. Those scenarios, those health scenarios, have been associated with higher rates of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And then some of the physiological stressors, like I alluded to earlier, the poor sleep, the chronic inflammation, chronic illness. Maybe to go to the other extreme though, right? Because those are all suboptimal health states. But maybe for the individual who's just an over-the-top exerciser, who's overtraining, well, that's also a good way to lower this shield, this secretory IgA shield, in your small intestine. Now, I have a quick note that I want to interject in here, which is that if you're wondering whether your gut shield is thin, well, we can measure it. In my practice, I use comprehensive stool testing, and that's going to be able to report directly to me what the secretory IgA levels are. So you'll know if your mucosal defenses, if this antibody is low, is it normal? Is it overactive, indicating that it's being overly reactive to something? Stool testing is going to help explain the why the terrain is not optimal and what's allowing this overgrowth in the first place. And this is one of the core tests that I offer in my practice. And if you're working with another clinician, make sure you ask that clinician that they include a fecal secretory IgA in the assessments that they're doing with you, because it's absolutely one of the most actionable markers when it comes to preventing SIBO relapse. Now that you understand what secretory IgA is, what it can do, how it protects you, and how it can ultimately help prevent a relapse for you, what are you going to do to support it? Well, here's a couple of practical steps that you can immediately implement. So number one is you're going to downshift your nervous system. To state this another way, if your nervous system is in a constant fight or flight mode, constant sympathetic state, well, you're not going to have optimal secretory IgA levels. So whether that means you need to just sit down and go through some slow breathing, 5 to 10 minutes at various times throughout the day, you need to have prayer, meditation, go for a short walk, whatever your downshift for your nervous system is, whatever is going to move you out of that fight or flight mode, you need to incorporate that routinely into your lifestyle. But remember, there's also nutrition for that mucosal lining and for this secretory IgA as well. You can support that by consuming vitamin A rich foods. A couple of things that come to mind for me on this are going to be things like egg yolks, liver. You can have all those colors in the produce and the plant foods that you consume. All those colors have the carotenoids in them. Those are going to be beneficial. You'll also have, for example, when you eat grass-finished meats, pasture-raised meats, the fats in those are going to have some fat-soluble nutrients in there. Vitamin A is going to be a part of that. And you're also going to have a greater intake of zinc, and these forms of zinc are going to be more usable as well. So that's something to consider. Now, there's also the notion that you can use your microbiome and you can support your microbiome. So for example, there's some prebiotics, there's some probiotics that can make a difference here, that can encourage secretory IgA production. On the probiotic side, there's two that I would look at here. Number one by far is going to be Saccharomyces boulardii, which is actually a beneficial fungus. But the other one that is a beneficial bacteria that you can look at is known as Lactobacillus rhamnosus. Now, I do want to say with either one of these, one of the observations in SIBO, and I'm being specific here, one of the observations in SIBO for increasing secretory IgA with these probiotics is that you don't need high dosages to be able to do this. Literally, probably on most of these products, one capsule, at the most 2 capsules a day is going to be sufficient to meet your needs here. You can also use prebiotics in this conversation as well to increase secretory IgA. I honestly don't do this with my patients, so I'm not going to delve overly deep into this, but there is some evidence around using partially hydrolyzed guar gum. That has been shown, for example, when it was implemented with rifaximin, the antimicrobial side, it did seem to actually amplify the benefits of rifaximin. But again, guys, I'm not going to advocate for this. So I'm telling you because it's out there, but I'm just asking you to be conscientious about your applications here. And if you do use it, you're probably best to use this once you get past phase 1, which is that kill phase, and get into phase 2, which is rebuilding these digestive secretions of secretory IgA, and start low and work the dose up. Just don't go full throttle on this one. The other thing is, kind of to that point I just made, is that remember, all these things are working as a team. You may be putting all this effort into secretory IgA, but you can't ignore your stomach acid. You cannot ignore your bile. You can't ignore your digestive enzymes. You've also got to acknowledge the motility. Where does that come into play? These are all going to inherently work together. And if you stop giving focus to one of these at the expense of the others, well, you're probably going to be headed back towards relapse. And maybe one of my favorite strategies here is to use direct supplementation of bovine-derived immunoglobulins. Now, these are immunoglobulins from bovine or from cattle sources. And the reason that I like these is not because they're inherently directly replacing secretory IgA, but they do have a little bit of IgA in these formulations, but they are giving immunoglobulins. It's just going to be in what's called an IgG form, which is just a different class of these immune system proteins. They have a very similar bonding effect, but they're also going to be well supported. Like the literature is very good on these of illustrating that they're going to bond up to these triggers that often cause a lot of the downstream problems with SIBO, and they're going to neutralize these triggers, which means that they're also going to neutralize those inflammatory cascades and not allow those inflammatory cascades to get kicked into gear. So this, to me, from a supplemental standpoint, this is absolutely one of my preferences of helping along that secretory IgA. But look at it this way, you can't do that at the expense of the other concepts that I've introduced to you here as well. If your SIBO has been stubborn, don't just chase bacteria. Rebuild the shield that keeps them from taking hold. Strengthen secretory IgA while supporting your bile, your acid, your motility, and your gut. Well, it becomes far less inviting to the overgrowth. And to see how bile flow teams up with the secretory IgA that we've been talking about, well, go ahead and watch this last video that I shot for you in this series, SIBO and bile flow.